we are good to go.
So, hi everyone, welcome to another vlog by the Butterfly Princess. So today I'm joined with Rachel Evans from Connect and Respect. This is a two-part series where we often talk about SEND in regards to education, whether this should be integrated in special school or a mainstream school. But this is a completely different angle. This two-part series is going to be looking at home education and how that can benefit people with children with SEND. So this episode is going to focus on home education, what that is, everything else. And then next year, in a few weeks' time, we're going to look at self-directed education. So this isn't really my area of expertise. So I'll pass it on now over to Rachel to explain in more detail.
Thank you very much, Steph, and so thank you very much for inviting me to talk.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you. I am Rachel Evans. I have two boys, aged 12 and 8. They both have SEND. They are both autistic and diagnosed with the same form of quite unusual form of autism called pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. My oldest boy has also got diagnoses of ADHD, sensory processing disorder. He's also got bilateral hearing loss, which he is technically aided in both ears. At the start of our journey, we knew he had significant challenges, my oldest one, from quite early on. But I was quite determined that we were going to go through mainstream schooling and we were going to, follow the path that is sort of expected. And it very quickly became obvious that was going to be a significant challenge. He got his diagnosis not long after he started school, and eventually we did 3 years. So we limped through 3 years of schooling. It was an incredible battle just to get his needs recognised and understood, even though he had a diagnosis. And then to get those needs met within the system was incredibly difficult. It was a battle from the start. His neurology basically doesn't fit with the one-size-fits-all schooling model, and there is very little flexibility in that model to be able to accommodate those needs. So we're effectively trying to fit, bless him, a square peg in a round hole. It was extremely challenging, and part of that package problem is a lack of knowledge and understanding within the mainstream system, but also the mainstream system itself is very, very inflexible. So we got in a position where for 3 years I was literally forcing him and dragging him physically into school, and I was expected to do this. It was expected that this was completely fine and completely normal. We had lots of behavioural issues, both in the classroom and within the playground, and then spilling out when we got home as well. And the school was very much, they understood that he had these needs, but the blame was still mine. I was not parenting correctly, or I was not doing the right things. I was very engaging with the school. I was very open. I was in constantly for meetings, trying to explain his needs and how that could be met in a different way. For lots of reasons, the school were extremely reluctant to get him an education healthcare plan. Knowing what I know now, I think they were very scared of the process and very unsure of the process. And they kept telling me he was absolutely fine and he didn't need it. But I have a child who was then barely eating, barely sleeping, barely drinking, and was an absolute shadow of himself. And in the end, I took matters into our own hands, and we paid an awful lot of money for a private educational psychologist report. to prove, because we were convinced that he needed more support than he was currently. And the school were giving him a degree of support. There was an additional TA in the classroom, but that TA was spread between lots of other children. So we still felt that his needs, and we were escalating behavioural challenges and everything else. And so we paid for the educational psychologist report, and he was basically shocked that he didn't have an EHCP already. And off the back of that, the school did apply for an EHCP, and I thought, fantastic, we're gonna get it. We're gonna.
It's right at the end of the tunnel, basically. But
the disappointment was devastating, because eventually what happened is it literally just cemented the support he was already getting, but we already knew that support wasn't enough. And when the EHCP got finalised, the school told the local authority that they could meet his needs fine, and therefore that completely shut down access to any other provision. And at this point we were all exhausted. I mean, literally, it was the whole family was starting to fall apart. And I had been researching home education. I knew a bit about it because my sister lives in New Zealand. She has 4 children. She homeschools over there. It's slightly different from what we do here within home education. So I was aware of it as a concept. But he did 3 years in the school. The EHCP meant that he had to stay in that school. And the provision outlined in his EHCP was nothing more than what he was already getting, which we already knew wasn't sufficient. And I literally could not do another year. He couldn't do another year. I couldn't do another year. And I decided, right, I've got to stop this now. I am expending so much energy fighting the system that I could basically stop fighting and pour all that energy into actually providing what he needs. And that's what I did. So he did 3 years. In hindsight, they were the 3 of the most stressful, awful years of our lives by a long shot. And I have never, ever regretted a decision to home educate. It's been 6 years now. We've been home educating nearly 6 years. And yes, there are days that are hard. Yes, there are times where you have a wobble and you think, what have I done? But compared to the 3 years we did in school, it's been amazing. And, you know, it has been absolutely positively life-changing for us. And, you know, he's now 12 and he's thriving. So we very much came to home education for him based on unmet SEN. But then my youngest was born, and again, it became obvious to me that whilst he had very similar challenges, he was a very different child. And although he had tried preschool, he was having significant challenges there. And I said, you know what? I'm already home educating one. And I actually put it to him. I said, you can go to school with your friends from like play school and childmind if you want to, or you can stay and be home educated with your brother. It's completely up to you. And he said, I just want to stay at home. And I was like, well, let's do that, because it's not a once in a lifetime decision. If he decided that he didn't want to be home educated anymore, he could go back into the system. It would be absolutely fine. So I'm in the unusual position where I have home educated my eldest because of unmet SEN, but by the time my second one came around, my knowledge of home education was so much better that I actually had to become a philosophical home educator, because I philosophically agreed with it, particularly for my children, over the schooling system. So my youngest is 8 and he's never ever been to school.
No. So how to get into school at home education is for like support, like forums and stuff that you can people you can talk to, or there must be like people you can professional people that you can talk to about it, because like how would children go about with exams and stuff, because schooling they do exams and stuff with them, so how does all that work?
Well, actually, I will definitely come on to that, because that is one of the biggest questions, along with socialization, which is the other big one that comes up regularly. But all of that is possible. The children who are home educated can still do exams and still do the schooling system exams like GCSEs and A levels. But as I will explain in a little bit, when you come into home education, you begin to realize that there is a lot of other paths out there and a lot of other ways to showcase your knowledge beyond the schooling system tests. So I think one of the biggest, and I think your question kind of alludes to it, is people, what is home education? And people, I think it's probably easier to say what home education isn't than what it is. So it is not school at home. And unfortunately, the pandemic crisis, lockdown, schooling at home has done nothing to help our image.
I know,
it's so people tend to think that as home educators, we need to recreate school at home, and the children are chained to their desks and they have to sit down, and you have to be a teacher and you have to follow the curriculum and you have to do 9 to 3, and none of that could be further from the truth. It is as it happens, education is in English law, education is the responsibility of parents. And most parents don't know this, and actually the school, so it's education that is legally compulsory, schooling isn't. And we have to make a distinction between education and schooling. Education is a broader way in which we help children to learn. Schooling is one method of doing that. And people, because we have had generations of schooling now, people have lost that understanding that actually it is parents who are responsible for education. And so actually home education is the legal default. You actually opt into the schooling system. And the whole purpose of Ofsted is to monitor schools that are providing a set level of education on behalf of parents. So which is why home educators are not Ofsteded. So when you look at your legal responsibilities, the Section 7 of Education Act 1996, I'm going to read this because it's quite specific. It's the duty of parents to secure education of children of compulsory school age. The parent of every child of compulsory school age shall cause him to receive efficient full-time education suitable to his age, his ability, aptitude, and his special educational needs, either by regular attendance at school or otherwise. And home education sits under the or otherwise bit. So whereas state schooling, and because you're mass educating a whole range of different individuals, so it basically uses a model of formal teaching of an expert with knowledge packaged up into set segments that you impart on a child at a set pace, at a set time, with set standards and a set progression rate. And it's a one-size-fits-all model. And many children can cope with this. Many children do cope with this. But obviously there are some children that can't and that don't. And it's no surprise that many of those children are those with SEND. And within home education, you are not required to fit that model. You are completely flexible to create an education that absolutely meets your child's needs. And therefore, you do not need to follow a schooling paradigm. You follow the paradigm that works for your child and the child that you have in front of you, because you're only educating that 1 or 2 or 3 children. You're not educating millions of children at the same time. So there are lots of, and the problem is, because we have only obviously most of us have only really experienced schooling, we only really understand that that's what education could look like. So when people come into home education, I was the same when I started. I was like, well, what are these other ways of educating that if it doesn't look like school, what could it look like? And so some people do school at home, some people do, and very, very few. And as lockdown crisis homeschooling shows, it's often very fraught. It doesn't tend to go very well. And that's often when people start, when they come to home education. and either one of two things happens. Well, I do. There are three things. Either it really, really works, fantastic if that works for you. It usually doesn't. If it doesn't work, either children end up back in school because parents have decided it doesn't work for them, or parents have taken an opportunity to go, do you know what? Let's look at different ways of doing this. And they pivot and change and start to learn about learning. And so while some people do school at home, the vast majority do a kind of hybrid, semi-structured kind of thing. So you might choose to do some more structured work around English and maths or science, for example. And you might be much more child-led around other subjects, such as things that interest them in geography or languages or history or whatever else. And there genuinely is as many ways to home educate as there are families out there doing it. There isn't a right and a wrong way. It's about finding what works for your child. Some people will adopt a sort of well-known sort of documented method, such as like a Montessori approach or Steiner approach or a Charlotte Mason curriculum type approach. And then some people, and I'm part of this group, so choose what's called autonomous education or self-directed education, or when you do it via home education, it's called unschooling typically. And I'm going to very briefly touch on this now because I think it's the most unfamiliar and the most different from schooling approach. And I'm going to briefly talk about it now, but we're going to do a whole vlog on this.
Yeah, that's going to be the subject for next time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But just to give you a kind of heads up, it is about understanding that all humans have an innate drive to learn. Because we're born, you know, as a little baby, can't do anything. And within 5 years, we have learned to walk and run and jump and kick and, you know, climb. And we've learned to communicate and talk. And these are all incredibly complex skills. And no one is formally taught this. You kind of learn it as you are in the environment, in your way of doing it and your opportunities. And you do that.
I fully understand where you're coming from with that, Rachel, because when I was at college, when I did my A-levels, I studied theology and philosophy. Oh. And one of the philosophies we studied was Plato and Aristotle. And we learned very much about Plato's analogy of the cave. So we sort of like learn, you know, about innate knowledge and stuff like how do humans know what a chair looks like is because we've seen what a chair looks like in the world of farms. So the world of farms is the perfect world, and the world in which we live in is an unperfect world. So we create from memory what that chair looks like, but in the perfect image.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, we trust that our children, our young children, will learn from the surroundings. You know, they see the chair, they see people interacting, they see us going about and being our adult selves, and children learn to play and they learn through modeling and observing. And we trust that up to the age of 5. But we also trust that adults can learn. I know you yourself, I just read something that you were saying that you've learned, done during lockdown, you've done some courses on SEND and autism. And so we trust and we know that as adults, if we want to learn something or it's useful for us or we need it or it's interesting or relevant, we go out and either get a book or we talk to people just like we're doing now, or you might Google it or you might do a course. That's also self-directed education. That is autonomous education. And we trust that adults can do it. But somewhere in this process, we stop trusting children between the ages of 5 and 18. and we decide that as we need to take over as adults, we need to impose upon them how to learn and what to learn and at what pace and what process to learn. And actually, when we talk about self-directed education for school-age children, all that we're doing is allowing that process that starts when they're babies to carry on through seamlessly right through the whole lives. So we don't suddenly take charge at the age of 4 or 5. And this is a very, very different way of looking at education. It is where, you know, parents are not viewed as teachers who are going to impart expert knowledge. They are facilitators and supporters of their children's passions and interests and understanding of the world. We are highly involved with our children, but not in a way that we control. We are there to facilitate, which is why my connect and respect is the words that I use for my website, because we're there about connecting with our children and respecting their individual journeys and then helping them on their way. Learning is very much viewed as a life skill, and something that we don't just do between 5 and 4 years at 18. It's something that we are encouraging our children to living and learning constantly throughout our lives. And once we know how to learn, we can then learn anything at any point, as opposed to when you're within a schooling model, when you're being told what to learn and how to learn it, you're a very passive recipient of that. Whereas when we're doing self-directed education, we are very active in our learning. We drive our own learning and our own understanding of things. So it is a very, very different paradigm. And so we're going to talk about this in much more detail again, but I just wanted to introduce it because it's such an alien concept to most people. So as you can see, there's so many different ways to educate, and there's no right and there's no wrong. It's about what works for your child. And when you have children with very individual needs, then the flexibility is what makes it so powerful. You know, you're not under any obligation to follow national curriculum. I mean, you can if you want to, but you're not obligated to. And I think one of the things that parents have witnessed when doing lockdowns or crisis schooling at home is some of the absurdities and the crazy things that are in the national curriculum for very young children. You know, the idea of fronted adverbials and subordinating conjunctions. You know, do 8-year-olds need to know this for life? They need to know this to pass a test at school, but do they need to know it for life? And when you are looking at home education, you have that flexibility to say, do you know what? We're not going to worry about fronted adverbials.
Yeah.
If you're interested and you want to know, fine, but we don't have to spend hours and hours and hours drilling this thing if it's not meaningful or relevant or interesting. And so you have a lot more control over content that is relevant to your child, that is interesting and that is meaningful for them. You're not held to the same sort of progression. So, and this is what, again, one of the massive benefits for me of home education is when you're in school and you have a child that's struggling particularly, it is a deficit model. Your child is always in deficit compared to their peers or compared to the expected progression. And so my child in school might have written a beautiful sentence that he's never done before, and it's amazing for him. But the fact that that's not yet meeting expectations as set by the national curriculum and is way below what his peers are doing, it can't be celebrated. It's not. So you're always in that deficit position. Whereas in home education, if he suddenly was to do this something, it's beautiful success. It's his success, and we can celebrate that. So it's a very much a positive model as opposed to a deficits model. And so progression is at their own rate. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you learn to write at the age of 4 or 8 or 14. It doesn't matter if you learn to read at the age of 4. No one sits in a job interview and says, well, it's very important we understand what age you learn to read. It doesn't matter. And home reading is incredible, and writing both are necessary when you're mass educating. But in home education, there are so many ways to learn that it does not become a blocker. My youngest has never had any formal lessons about anything ever, and yet his reading is progressing beautifully. He's not yet a fluent reader, but the fact that he's needing my help less and less, and he's picking up more and more words, and now he's starting to find patterns in words that he knows and extrapolate those patterns into words that he doesn't know. And he's 8.5. In school, a non-fluent reader at 8.5 would be a problem. They will be in special measures, they'll be on a special table, they'll be getting extra, and the only method that they can use to teach is phonics. And for some children, phonics doesn't work. But for home education, you can use any method that works. So if you're wanting to formally teach to read in home education and phonics isn't working, then find something else. You know, you don't need to keep peddling the same problem if it doesn't work for you. And so that flexibility, that if your child, for example, is struggling to learn how to tell the time on an analog clock, then teach them on a digital clock. You know, in actual real life these days, there are not that many analog clocks about. So actually, whilst it's a critical thing that you have to tick off a national curriculum, actually, when you're in home education in the real world, it actually doesn't really matter. And actually, writing is much sort of a later progression in our household, because we have lots of issues of fine motor skills and control and so on. So typing has become the most, you know, the most skillful thing that we need to learn. And actually, when you look in real life, how often do many of us write? Most people are either typing or using voice to text or all the other technology that's available to us. So we can really start to unpack what is really important for our child, what's important for their journey in life, and prioritize that over just knocking off content from a national curriculum. So you can see, if you have child with very individual needs, how being able to have that flexibility to really meet those needs is a massive advantage. The other thing is really important to explain is that people assume that once you come out of schooling system that you won't be able to access things like speech and language, and you won't be able to access occupational therapy. That is simply not true. Those are often mostly deployed via schools because that's where most children are. But actually, you can still access those outside of a school system. And actually, what's really interesting is that what I have found from my personal experience in my children, but also the stories that I've heard from other families, is that the need for these interventions actually subside and reduces when you're not trying to get your child to conform into that model. And once you step back and allow your children to develop at their own pace naturally, you'll find that a lot of these interventions are not required anyway. But that's just been my personal experience. But you can access them if you need to. You can still have an education healthcare plan when you home educate. That's not a problem either. I think particularly another advantage of home education, particularly when you've got children, autistic children, is things like sensory overload and sensory issues that cannot be accommodated in schools can be very easily accommodated in home education. So my youngest cannot stand still. So invariably, when he's trying to communicate something to me or explain something or we're discussing something, he invariably has a football at his feet, and he invariably is using that football and manipulating it, but that allows him to be able to talk. When he's trying to stand still or sit still, that sensory processing can't happen. So within home education, that would be a problem. If he couldn't sit still and talk or communicate with a teacher at school, that would be a problem. But within home education, it really isn't. With my eldest, when I was reading lots to him, particularly reading sort of Harry Potter, and I remember sitting one day like, why is this child upside down? He was lying on his bed, his head dangling over the front, because he again found it difficult to sit still. He was listening, he was taking it all in, but he needed to be doing what his body was telling him. Now, you can't do that in school.
No, because it's so regimented.
Yeah, and so, there's no requirement to wear a school uniform. I mean, home educated, there's no requirement to wear anything if you don't need to. But and that being crowded into a room of 30 children, it's a massive sensory load for many children, and you could just manage that in home education. And if you need to build up the sensitivity to those, then you can do it in a managed and controlled way, as opposed to the sink and swim that it is in school. So you have much more control over your environment. And I think the final thing I'll say about the benefits for SEND children is that for home education, whereas schools are very academic focused, and they bolt on a few bits of, you know, or you might do a social skills group once a week, or you might do, you know, you might do a bit on healthy eating or whatever. Home education allows you to focus on the things that are most important, and that it doesn't just include academics. That includes, you know, building relationships, your self-awareness and self-control, your personal sort of needs and your self-motivation and your self-awareness, all of those things. So when I first took my eldest out of school, our relationship was extremely fractured. I had basically betrayed his trust. I should have been his safe person, and I took him literally kicking and screaming to school for 3 years. And understandably, his trust in me as a trusted adult was completely broken. So I spent a lot of the first year just rebuilding trust and rebuilding relationships. And that is not seen as important within a school environment. But for me and for my children, and from my view is that these are fundamental. If you don't have these things in place, then you can have all the academic learning in the world. It's not gonna create a rounded, mature, you know, person. So home education allows you to be much more holistic in the way that you educate your child and not just focus on academics. Talking about socialization, because it comes up every time. And then I'll talk about exams. So it is a myth that home educated children are locked up like Harry Potter under the stairs.
Yeah. They're not like locked up under the stairs and you can only come out at meal times.
Exactly. We're not chained to the kitchen table. You know, we are, when we home educate, some of it happens at home, but a lot of it happens outside. And this is where, for us, pandemic has been a problem too, because we're not doing what we would normally do. We're normally out in parks. We're normally out visiting places. We're normally doing activities and events and being out in the real world, mixing with real people, doing real jobs, you know, with lots of different children of different ages with different interests and different abilities and disabilities, and therefore we are building our social skills and are having our educators in the real world.
Yeah.
It makes me laugh. A lot of people say, well, if they're home educated, how would they ever manage in the real world? Like, we are in the real world. That's exactly where we are. And I think with socialization, it's a very different beast in home education than it is in schools. In schools, you are kind of grouped to at the same time as you were all born, and the same age children. Because of catchments, you're all very much in a same socio-economic group because of school catchments, or very similar. And you know, you're and sometimes you can even be segregated by sex as well. You know, sometimes you've got the single sex schools, so you're potentially in a classroom with single sex in a single age group. And that's not how humans are evolved to learn social skills. We are evolved to learn social skills by being in a village, or being in a village structure whereby you've got younger people and older people, and the younger children can learn the social skills from the more, you know, proficient older people, and the older children or older people learn to nurture the younger. So you have this kind of, you know, learning both ways, which simply doesn't happen in schools. Whilst it's easier to develop social friendships within a school because you've got 30 children at the school gate openly available to you, it is harder within home education. There are thousands and thousands of children who are home educated, but you do have to make the effort to go and find those children and to build those relationships and go to groups and foster friendships. So it requires more work on behalf of parents, definitely, but it certainly should not be seen as a barrier to home educating. The other barrier, which you talked about earlier and asked about, is exams and qualifications. So GCSEs and A-levels, for example, are very much school system measures. And many home educated children do actually do them. They do them as private candidates, external candidates. And parents are completely liable for all the costs, and this can be considerable, which is something the home education world is campaigning for, to make more affordable access to exams. But basically, if your child wants to do them, You basically find an exam centre, find which exam board you would like to use, the subjects, you get the content. You'll often find that home educated children will run through that content very quickly, much quicker than they would within a school environment. You might get a tutor, you might not. You might choose to do that find other children that are doing it and learn it all together. You might do online courses. It's much more varied. And then you would simply sit the exam. Just as an external candidate.
Yeah.
And so you do it. But even if you choose to go that route, you can choose what subjects you want to do. So whatever's on offer, not just what is confined to your school. You can do it any time you want and any number you want at any time. So you don't have this one-shot deal that you have in schools where at the age of 16 you have to take 10 GCSEs and that's your one-shot chance at it. Home education is much more flexible. You can choose to do 2 1 year or 2 another year or 3, or just the subjects you're very, very passionate and interested in. And so again, it's a much more flexible. I mean, you might choose to be an adult by the time you decide to actually you need or want any formal qualifications. The flexibility is there. And also, particularly for children, autistic children, or that might have like dyscalculia or dyspraxia or dyslexia, they might not be developmentally ready at 16 to do it. They might not be able to show themselves their best advantage at 16. So maybe waiting a few more years before you do that might be more developmentally appropriate for them. And you have that flexibility in home education. And I think what's interesting is that once you start looking at home education, you realize that there are lots and lots of different ways to showcase your talent and your knowledge. And the more you look, the more you see. So we're kind of fed this story in school that if you don't get your GCSEs and A-levels or whatever and do really well, that you're going to be
the end of the world, basically.
Yeah. And actually, that's true for some people, but actually it's not true for everybody. And actually, once you start seeing and interacting with people that didn't necessarily follow that path through high academia, you start to see that there are lots of other ways that people have been able to be successful in their lives. And I have a lovely story, and it was from an unschooling page whereby this child has basically spent most of his childhood designing websites for friends and for family, and he just he wanted to be a web developer. That's what he wanted to be when he was grown up. And he applied for a job as a web developer, and despite having no formal qualifications in anything, and he got the job over some graduate candidates. And
that's really good. That's really good news.
And the reason he got the job is because he had a portfolio of websites to show them that he had already built. So he already could demonstrate that he was doing the job. And the fact that he had been doing it also conveyed that he had, a level of numeracy and literacy that allowed him to do that. So despite the fact that he had no formal qualifications, that was not a barrier for him. Now, in some jobs, if you want to be a doctor, yes, I would imagine that's going to be a barrier. But not everyone's going to be a doctor. And so it's about breaking that misconception that you have to have these things at 16 in order to do anything with your life. And when you're in home education, you really start to understand that there are lots of different ways to follow your passions and to get to where you want to be. And if at some point in your path you get to a point where actually you do need a qualification, then you go and get it then. It's not this one shot at 16 or at 18 that it is in the schooling system. You can just, if you come across a barrier where you need a qualification, go and learn it, go and get it. You just do it when you need it. Which I think, particularly when you have children who are don't have atypical, neurotypical development profile, then that again is a very big benefit of home education. So when you, so there's lots of ways to showcase your knowledge. You talked about where to start and how you go about it. I'm going to address that now for you. If your child is in school and you want to home educate, unless they are in a local authority paid for special school, in England and Wales, it is completely easy. You write a letter. There's a set template that you can download from home education websites, and the registration is immediate from that point. It is that simple. If your child is as an EHCP and are in a special school that's provided for by the local authority, you do have to apply for permission to remove from school roll. There are a myriad of people and support networks out there. The home education community is extremely knowledgeable, is very, very experienced, and is more than happy to help. You have minimal input from the school system or the local authority, but there is a massive, massive amount of knowledge and experience within the home education community. There is a at the end, I'm going to run through a couple of places you can go for this information, but there's a huge numbers of Facebook groups. There are huge numbers of websites where you can plug directly into any advice or guidance that you might need, or if you need signposting anywhere. You don't get any financial help to home educate. You are basically taking back your responsibility, your legal responsibility to home educate, and therefore you're on your own. So that is something you do need to bear in mind. However, saying that, people assume you have to be rich to home educate. You really don't. I'm a single parent. It can be as expensive or as cheap as you want it. There's an awful lot of free resources out there. And there's an awful lot of ways of sharing costs with other families. So it really is not, it's not the sort of limited to those who, there is a financial constraint, but it's not as big as you would think. It is really important that you understand your rights and there is a general feeling within most professionals that whether they're medical professionals or whether they are local authority professionals, that all children should be in school. There is a very poor understanding of how, particularly for SEN and D children, that how that can meet their needs. Most professionals, unfortunately, believe that home education is school at home. So you do need to be aware of your rights, and you do need to get your knowledge up and understand it. It says, and I would strongly recommend you don't try and do it in isolation, that you do join the Facebook groups, whether it be national groups or local groups, because it would be extremely difficult to do it in isolation. But those groups are out there. And there's literally hundreds of them. If you search on Facebook, right, like home education in your area, there's loads will pop up. And there's Facebook groups for home educating special, additional needs. So there's lots and lots of subgroups as well. A great website that I send people to. So I on my own personal website, connectandrespect.co.uk, I have a further resources section where I give you links to lots of different websites, including Education Otherwise and Educational Freedom, who both are exceptionally good. They also have, certainly Educational Freedom has other social media outlets as well. And they're certainly on Facebook. I think they're on Instagram and Pinterest. There are, say, hundreds of national and regional Facebook groups. And so there's lots and lots of blogs and vlogs out there for home educators that share what they do and how they do it. So there is a wide range of resources that you can start to, if you start it, don't run in and rush in and think you've got to do everything. Just relax, connect with the children, read and find out about how children learn and what's going to work for your child. Because when I first started, I thought, right, I like a structure. We're going to do semi-structure, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And it completely fell apart because that met my needs, but it didn't meet his needs.
Yeah.
So and that's how I got into unschooling and self-directed education. Is I had to look at his needs and what he needed. I took myself on a journey to find out more about what he needed and what could best suit his needs. So there's loads and loads and loads of information out there. You just got to go out and try it and do it. So really, that's kind of, I don't know if that's kind of my broad sort of skip through home education. I think I kind of touched on the socialization and exams. Was there any other things that you?
No, there was nothing. Obviously, I'll just do a quick recap of what we've talked for this. So thank you for joining me today. It's been really insightful. And obviously, when we first got in contact, you realised that I was very pro-mainstream, and I am, but from listening from what you've said today in today's first episode, it's been really interesting to listen to, because you can understand why parents do it. Some parents do it because parents are the people that know the children best. No one knows the children better than the parents, and also I've come from a place that you can learn anywhere, so it don't have to be just in a classroom. It can be on the internet or watching a TV program. Like when I was at school, we had to do modern foreign languages. Part of the GCSE was either French or German. And when I was at school, I couldn't study for French and German at school because that pace of what the school was doing, it wasn't right for me. But now I'm learning German and Portuguese by using online apps like Drops and Duolingo, and they're the right pace for me, and everything else. So I'm enjoying learning it more now when I'm nearly in my 30s than I would do at like my schooling age.
Exactly, and I think that's it. We say we trust this process that as adults we will learn in a way that's meaningful for us, and I think with home education that just allows us to do that for our children too. And I think particularly when they have special educational needs, I think 50% research that was in 50% of children who are home educated have some kind of SEND, and there's a reason for that. Is because quite often they struggle to keep up with the pace or the environment of school. And then home education allows that more natural development, natural pace for them. And unfortunately, most people don't understand, what home education is, or have misunderstand what it is. So it's been really lovely for me today to be able to share with you kind of what we do, so that people can see a different view of home education and how it can work really, really well. And for some people don't want to do it, and that's absolutely fine. But when I started off, with my eldest in school, I didn't know it was even an option. It had never been on my radar before. So I only wish, looking back now, I wish I'd never sent him to school. I wish we'd home educated from the start, but I didn't know that then. And so I want to use my experience and knowledge now to allow people to see what it is like and the possibilities for it, so that if a family wants to go that way, then they know about it and feel they can be supported by the community to do it. So I'm really grateful to be able to share what I've learned over the last few years, Steph.
So thank you again, Rachel, and I'm really looking forward to doing vlog number 2 on the 22nd about self-directed education. Like we touched briefly on it today, but it'd be nice to go into further detail about it. So I'll see you then, and to everyone for tuning in, because this will be uploaded on social media. Thanks for tuning in, and if you want to get with either me or Rachel, just check out the Butterfly Princess Send Initiative Facebook page and the Respect and Forget Facebook page and website, and we'll help you in whatever way we can.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Steph.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.